on this. All right, here we go. View, full screen. All right, gentlemen, I think it's just gentlemen on this call. Thank you for joining me on this one. Today, this is the last module of this buildings and home design module. And this module is like about preparing for disaster or prepping or disaster preparedness. There's a lot of different ways to look at this, and that's pretty much what we're going to do. We're just going to look at all these different ways to look at it, just to help get our heads around it, because it's a big topic. So, doomsday preppers. The world has always been ending, right? Ever since we've become humans, conscious humans, using this prefrontal cortex with our cognition and language, we've had this ability to like use our memory to track patterns, but from those patterns, we try and make predictions of the future. And when we can imagine the future or try and make predictions of the future, we can imagine all these variations of what could happen in the future. And we basically can imagine our own death, all the different ways that we can die and kill each other. It's really like, this is kind of, it's like, it's at this core wound of becoming conscious and realizing our vulnerabilities as humans. And so this idea of the world ending or something, some disastrous event disrupting the world as we know it has always been there. And we can look back at some of the old stories like Noah's Ark, who is, you know, kind of the original prepper. So we've always had this thing of preparing. Oh, sorry, too far ahead. But one thing is for certain. One thing is for certain is that the future is uncertain, right? And the only limitation is our imagination. And as humans, we get to choose our own adventure. There's definitely conditions and things that will happen to us, conditions changing beyond our control, and we have to adapt to that. But when that happens, we still get to choose our own adventure in how we respond and recover from those things. So I did a little digging around on the internet, and it was cool to see what, you know, comes up in the forums of this crossover and differentiation between permaculture and prepping. And here's some of the favorite things I found, like on this thread. I consider myself both someone who subscribes to some of both permaculture and prepping principles. Permaculture is a way of life focused on living in harmony with the environment. Prepping is a way of life focused on surviving when something goes wrong with the environment. Then there's this one here. I wish I could build a canopy thick enough to protect me from a nuclear blast, and then just add more mulch was the comment. It's because permaculture and prepping are exactly the same thing. And then Caldrius, it's more like all permaculture is prepping, but not all prepping is permaculture. If we sort of look at this idea of people preparing with bullets and armory and all sorts of those things, but not actually thinking in the long term. And this is another one I like. I'd say permaculture is often what happens when you get through the 5 stages of grief. Dmitry Orlov wrote this thing ages ago about the 5 stages of collapse, talking about how there's this predictable pattern of response to collapse, which is denial, then comes anger, then comes bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. Preppers get caught in a weird loop between bargaining and anger, whereas permaculture is more about getting on with the business of living within the limits of your ecology, community, and making a better future. So the argument there is that permaculture is when we've gotten to that level of acceptance of just like, okay, this is where it's at, this is what's going to happen, and this is how we get on with it. This is a good little meme here. The line between permaculture and prepper is very thin. Just ask my YouTube ads. Permaculture peeps are woo-woo preppers. I thought preppers were woo-woo permaculturists. And this one is pretty funny. A prepper is motivated by fear, a permaculturist motivated by love. And then this one here kind of, which finishes it off and brings it home. I totally agree. I think that being prepared has taken on a new connotation. The motto of Boy Scouts is to be prepared. And I don't think it's a reference to being heavily armed or living in a bunker, recognizing that the environment is in bad shape. Our power grid, water, and food supplies are all hanging on by a thread is not hard to notice. COVID really brought that out to the forefront, and anyone with any sense has to look at that and decide whether they want to continue to rely on these systems or insulate themselves from disruptions. It's not a right-left political thing. It's a risk assessment. And, you know, there's the case to be made that everyone doing this course, including me even sharing it, is part of this preparing for what's coming. Although some people, you know, are not motivated or thinking about those things. They're just doing these, you know, wanting to get back to nature and more of a sort of just a spiritual connection with it. But like I said in that other slide, as humans, we're always preparing. We're preparing for an uncertain future, whether we are saving for a rainy day or we're putting a roof over our head for next time it rains. Like, we're always preparing for this future that may or may not unfold. Okay, so back to that last comment there. It's not a right-left thing. It's a risk assessment, okay? So if or when shit hits the fan, really, it can happen on a individual or global scale, but our goal is to reduce our risk, to buffer ourselves from these uncertainties that can disrupt our normal lives. But how do we do that? Okay, so first we start with this sector analysis that we did earlier in the course. And that sector analysis is going to tell us where potential fire threats might come from, where potential flood threats are or come from, storms and things, right? Especially for potential natural disasters or and things like that. But then also we want to know, how do we prepare for these things and what do we prioritize, right? What's the different exposure we have to different threats, and what's our risk profile look like? And are we going to bunker down, or are we going to bug out, right? Bail, like if a fire's coming and we know we can't defend the property, are we ready to bug out as well? So that's sort of what we have to prepare for both scenarios. And we want to hope for the best and prepare for the worst. Now, this bottom line, the quality of your life will be directly proportional to how prepared for these crises you really are. That's a link there you can see to Permaculture Apprentice. I think it's Matt Powers is his name. Awesome guy. If you guys don't already follow him, very prolific content producer in the realm of permaculture. And this is like 2-part article series that he's got, which I like. So I put the link in there. So our goal is to reduce the risk, reduce our risk profile to different threats. And I found this equation, which I think helps break it down a little bit, right? Because when we think of all the possibilities, you know, we can take it to all these extremes and it can be quite overwhelming. And we need a way and a system to sort of prioritize risk and be realistic about what risks we face. You know, obvious ones like storms and bushfires, but we can take it as far as we want to go. So this equation is great for that. Basically, we have the hazard. The hazard is the threat. It's a flood, it's a fire, it's a cyclone. It might be extreme weather of some kind. It might be a man-made threat or hazard as well, you know, whether it's sheer incompetence or actual pure malice and tyranny at a local level, at a global level, could be anything. That's the hazard. Then we have our exposure to that hazard, right? Which is kind of geographically determined. It's climatically and bioregionally and even sort of site specific. You know, if we live in the lower part of a flood catchment, as opposed to people higher in the catchment, we're in the same bioregion. We would get the same kind of rainfall, but the people in the low-lying areas are more have more exposure to the same hazard. But at the same time, you know, people in the desert don't have the same exposure to people in snow country, that kind of hazards. So that's geographically determined. And then there's our vulnerability, right? And the vulnerability is more personal. It comes down to our personal context. It comes down to our support systems that we have in place. And it comes down to the capital and the resources that we have available to us in all its forms, not just money, not just material, all of the resources that we have available to us. And we're going to get into more of that stuff in the next module, doing all this kind of assessment or stock take of what resources we have available to us. And then that's all divided by our capacity to cope, right? So if we have very little capacity to cope, our risk might be high in a certain situation, like let's say two people in a floodplain, they're both in the same geographical location. They might have very similar personal contexts and available resources, but one might have more capacity to cope. They have more resilience, and so they can get through the disaster or when shit hits the fan, whether it's personal or local or global, better. So we have these two parts that we can work on, right? Like we can partially mitigate our exposure to a threat via where we choose to live. But once we're in a location, once we've got our spot that we want to live, the two things that we can work on is our vulnerability by working on our support systems, building up our capital, clarifying our context, and maximizing what we have, and our capacity to cope and our resilience, right? And our resilience really is like all of the internal stuff, right? This is our ability to hold optimism rather than pessimism when things are going wrong, or our ability to keep our self-belief, our control of self, our willingness to adapt, right? If all sorts of unknown future events can happen, which we may or may not be able to predict, how willing are we to adapt to these new scenarios and be flexible, solve problems, have this emotional awareness? That's a big thing, especially in times of crisis and disaster, of like really not only in ourself of what's going on emotionally, but in others as well, because we all get pushed and like to capacity in these situations. How much social support do we have? And our sense of humor, right? This is all to do with our resilience and our capacity to cope. So if we can improve these things, we can handle disasters, crisis, when shit hits the fan much better. Okay, shit hits the fan, prepping. This is scary stuff that can bring up a lot, right? Whether we're doing really basic risk assessments for bushfires, floods, storms, tornadoes, right, which are quite regular. The risk is quite high in that, it's not an out there kind of thing to happen, to go into, full-blown zombie apocalypse. If we actually sit there, imagine that, feel that future playing out, it can actually bring up a lot of stuff, especially if we've gone through similar things. So these are some little notes that I've just threw down that for me going through these processes has really helped, right? On the first sort of base layer is our mind, body, and soul, like this relationship with our mind, our body, and our soul, and having a resilient state of being, keeping our vehicle, our bio vehicle, in a good state of being. That really helps navigate all of this sort of stuff. The other thing is that faith is not an option. And what I mean by that is, and it comes back to this slide before, of as humans, we've always been imagining the end of days, the end of the world, some crazy disaster that has happened that we remember or keep telling the story, or could happen, right? Like if you look at when I was putting together this lesson, there's like a Wikipedia article about all of the predictions of the end of the world, and it's never ending. It's a never ending list. It's been going on since day dot. And so it's really tied in deep into our belief system. And this idea that faith is not an option is at that deep core subconscious belief level. We are always placing our faith in something. And so it's really good for us to look at where our beliefs are anchored. Do we actually believe it is all going to hell in a handbasket and we have no chance? And is that where we're orientating our decisions from? So it's a really big thing to look at, and it's pretty much all of the next module. Like that's really what we're diving into there in the next module. From there, we can also run these scenarios, right? Like we can imagine, some of us might have been through some disasters, bushfires, floods, storms. So we can imagine what's already happened, but then we could imagine other things that could happen or could be worse. And it's like we have to be honest with ourselves, at least for me, right? Because I'm sometimes overly optimistic. But yeah, being honest with the threats, whether it is just preparing for a flood or a bushfire or a storm, we sort of have to swallow that bitter pill and do the work now to prepare for it, but also by being realistic and not getting too carried away with, you know, letting our imagination run wild with all the possible things that could go wrong. From there, we're going to imagine all these things. We're going to feel it. We're going to feel these things. They're going to come up. We've got to sit with it. We've got to let it flow, and we can seek support. This is like going to the gym. And when we go to the gym and we work out or we do work, when we then face some other work later in the day, it's not so hard. Or when we do an ice bath. So when we voluntarily submit ourselves to pain or distress, then when distress or challenge comes to us, when we're not asking for it, we have more resilience and more ability to face it. So when we allow those emotions to flow through, we can, we're not as shocked or upset or anything. There's less emotions to process when it actually happens. And then we stay solutions and systems focused. So working with the power of 3, which there's a few variations to look at this. We start small and we're in it for the long haul, right? And I will dive into that in a little bit, next few slides. So all of this comes back to this question and asking ourselves, well, what do we actually really need to survive? If shit hits the fan, whether in our own personal context, familial context, community context, bioregional, national, global, it brings up the question of like, what do we actually need to survive? Now, there's the base level: food, water, shelter, and, you know, sex to continue the species, you might say, procreation. That's like the basic physical stuff. And then we need to, we need each other, basically. We need each other as well. So the way I've kind of like seen it as I was like putting this together and reflecting on my own process with this is this power of 3. There's 3 layers to it of what we actually need. First is that our mindset matters. It actually matters how we face these things. Do we face them with dread, with, you know, like a, I don't know what the word is, like a kick in our heart or like a step in our stride, you might say, like, let's go. We're running these thought experiments, whether we're like, what if I lose my job? Do I have enough income for 3 months, 6 months? Like all of these things, we're constantly running these scenarios in the future of what could go wrong. How can I buffer myself against that? And there is a bit of an emotional process in all of that. So our mindset matters. This is the internal world. And we're really going to look at that next module. Then there's the physical world. These are our basic needs, right? We've got our food, water, heating, power, right? Which is what we looked at with the alternative technologies. All of that stuff that we looked at in the alternative technologies, when we have these off-grid systems, that's really buffering us from a lot of threats. Unless, right, there's a bushfire that comes and wipes everything out at our property, then we have to have like a mobile setup to do all of the same things so that we can move somewhere else, whether we have it personally or there's a community hall that we can go to. We need these basic physical needs. And then there's beyond that, the next layer is the relational world, which is the trusted community network. And that trusted community network can be done through official and unofficial channels, right? This is our family, these are our neighbors, these are our friends, community members. And we're going to look at that a little bit further down in the lesson, right? So we've looked at the mindset stuff up until this point, like covered a few things, and we're going to dive into it more in the next module. We've also done this physical stuff in the alternative technologies thing and the trusted community network we're going to look at a little bit down the track. So focusing on these practical things. When shit hits the fan, it can happen fast without warning, and it's hard to respond if you haven't even planned for it. If you haven't thought about it, you haven't planned for it, if you've had your head in the sand, it's going to be hard to respond. Those who prepare reduce the impact and recover quickly afterwards. This is well researched, well documented. Communities who can prepare for disaster, reduce the impact, they will recover quickly afterwards. Now, these disasters, these crises, I sort of see it as there's twofold, right? There can be these man-made ones that we create ourselves, and they can be sort of tyrannical by nature or economic collapse, right? So like at a collective level, but also at an individual level, we can be in a personal situation where we're really in a, like, an abusive relationship even, and it's gotten so bad that our whole lives are falling apart. There's so many things that can happen to us, whether individually or collectively. So we can create these crises for ourselves. And then there's natural ones, which we actually have no control over, and it just happens. And they seem to be elemental, right? So there's earthquakes, there's big fires or volcanoes, there's big floods and rain or wind and storms and cyclones, tornadoes, all of that's elemental. It can just destroy things. And then there's also like living crises, like a plague or a viral threat, like you could argue, at least the mainstream world argued, that the COVID was a viral crisis and threat to everything. So there's these two things that can happen, and it's a lot to try and consider all of it and to try and prepare or plan for all of it, which is nearly impossible. But it happens, right? Whether we want to look at it or not. So a couple of examples is this tornado that happened on the Gold Coast. I've never heard of a tornado happening in our bioregion in my 39 years of living, and it happened on Christmas Day. And there's some photos there of what ripped through, and I saw some of the damage, like up around Tamborine, where Brett lives, days after it happened. And I could see where the actual tornado had ripped through and trees were flattened. It was quite massive. And where we were at Natural Bridge, we had no power for 12 days over Christmas in the middle of summer. And that gave us a taste of what's possible. It revealed some big weaknesses and vulnerabilities at our property, especially around power, because all of our houses are still grid connected. And I, just launched this campaign to raise money to buy the property around this shit hits the fan prepping thing. And I was like, oh wow, we are not ready, like, for power, like power and water. That's like basic fundamentals, and we just didn't. Yeah, we were just exposed to that risk, right, massively. And then while that we had no power, we put on a party for 200 people at New Year's Eve, and we hired a generator, so we had power down on the creek flat. We didn't have the solar set up at that time. And it's New Year's Eve, and we're like, oh, wow, okay, this is great. We're going to go into this. There was no rain. The creek, you guys that were there for the creek, you can see it there full and flooding. When we went into New Year's Eve, the creek hadn't even flooded all season, right? Like, it was, you could still walk through, was still paddling along. I ran into these guys who are across the creek, who you can see there. I ran into them just this weekend at Island Vibe Festival, and they were like telling me that on that afternoon, New Year's Eve, these kids, they had that night, actually, they had their own little disco, like up somewhere just up here, up in the creek, just near the crossing, that they were like, the adults weren't allowed at. And they were all up in there playing, just running around. And then at 7:30, we got like 80 mils in half an hour. And it was wild. And then it stopped raining, and then the stars came out, and we had an awesome night. And then between 1 a.m. and 4 or 5 a.m., we must have got like another 200 mil. And then it just kept going all day. That creek came up faster than it had ever come up before. We had 200 people at the property. We foolishly sent people across the creek thinking they would be fine. They could come back over. They couldn't get back over. The kids wanted to go home. We had to get the SES in. Some big lessons there. And fortunately, our roads, because we've had a lot of wet weather events, our roads were pretty good. So everyone could just drive out. We didn't have to tow anyone out. That was good. We've definitely, getting better. But this was a big wake up. Like these people were stranded across the creek. We couldn't get them back. We had to call in the SES. And if you look at the data there, right, look at the top. So that rain gauge is down at the school, and Numbamba alert, sorry. So that was like 300 mils across the 48 hours. And then up at Numbamba, which is up at the top, like near the border, so about 4 k's away from us, that's about 500 mils in 48 hours. But that's from 9 a.m. to 9 a.m. So that's saying from 9 a.m. on the 31st to 9 a.m. on the 1st was 273, but we didn't get anything until like that first dump. And then, in the morning. So we got 500 mils in 36 hours. And I was like, wow, that's wild. I've never seen we had all this big rain. I've never seen that creek come up so fast. And I was like, is that as bad as it could get? Could it get worse? And yes, it can. In the 2013, from the same Numbamba daily rainfall chart, it tells me on the 28th, 2013, it was 653 mils in 24 hours. That's like 2.5, 3 times of what we experienced. And you can see there was 200 mils either side of that. So we're talking a meter of rain in a couple of days. So I'm like, oh my gosh, like in that situation, what would happen? Would the water have come up and broke over the banks? Like it already did break the banks around that hot tub. We had to evacuate people. Anyway, the story is these things can happen when we least expect them. And we need to think about it and be prepared. So another little angle here, disaster prep. I found this meme: dance like no one's watching, love like you've never been hurt, and make friends like there will be supply chain or social infrastructure collapse and you will have to rely on each other for basic survival. I probably should have put this further in the down the end in the community trust network, right? Because that's really big part of this. What we've just been looking at now is more just the practical things, right? If you look at like official state emergency services and all that kind of stuff, people who deal with disaster prep professionally, they kind of have this 4 pillars of when stuff goes wrong: crises, disasters, when shit hits the fan. On the front foot, we can prevent and prepare ourselves for these disasters. So we can't prevent, bushfires, we can't prevent floods, but we can prevent our vulnerability to it, and sometimes our exposure. So we can buffer, we can prevent the impact, and we can prepare for when it comes, making plans, getting our emergency kits ready, getting our backup systems ready. And then when it actually happens, we then have these 2 parts, which is the response, the immediate response when we're in the actual crisis. What are we doing? How are we responding? And that's, tied into our resilience. And then also, how do we recover? Like after the initial crisis has passed, how do we put all these things back together, right? The mob in the States right now with Hurricane Helena, is massive, right? And when I was looking at this stuff earlier in the year about prepping and what that looks like, I found out that with Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and Helena's worse, the city of New Orleans had no power for 3 months. 3 months, no power, right? We went no power for 12 days, and that was a big challenge. Tarale actually went and bought a backup generator. Hardware stores sold out of generators because people were trying to get backup generators because, there was no power for 12 days. But imagine what would happen if like a whole bioregion went down with no power for 3 months. What would happen? What would life look like? Would we be ready for that? At this governmental official level, there is lots of support, right? Like there is lots of disaster groups set up. We have at these like, and disasters are generally managed at a local level, like at a council level. We have our rural fire brigades, we have our local SES departments. So that's basically how, on an official level, we manage things. But then it's linked into disaster groups, district disaster groups, state coordination, and then national coordination. So if anybody, I'm curious, is anybody involved in rural fire or SES? Anybody at all? Yes, no? Something to consider. I'm also not, but you know, it's probably a good network to be plugged into. All right, lots of support, right? This, when I look at this stuff online, it's all about natural disasters as well, but it's good information, right? So this is all links, right? We got a link to the Queensland one, knowing your risk, making plans, packing emergency kits. New South Wales has got guides up. Victoria's got guides up. You know, if we look at what you can do, the main risks, you know, for people in Queensland: bushfire, flooding, storms, heat wave, cyclone, and all these practical things that you can do to help prepare. A lot of it's common sense, right? Having an emergency plan, preparing for evacuation, knowing where you would go if you had to evacuate, knowing who you would contact, having your little emergency kit ready so that you can throw it all in the car. Your emergency kit might be just a camping kit, right? So when you go camping, you've got that set up. Preparing your home, right? So what you can do at home, practical things, which we're not going to go, we'll touch on a little bit, but you know, cleaning up your property, keeping your leaves out of your gutters for fire or for floods, right? All these practical things, which are common sense for a lot of us that live on land or have been doing this thing, looking after our own place for a while. It's common sense. If we've been through some extreme weather, it's common sense. A lot of people, right, haven't done that, haven't had to think about that. They've been living in the city and haven't had to think about that at all. And even me, right, coming on this journey of getting on land, you still do silly things. You're like, oh gosh, I just have to be ready. Like I have to assume that crazy shit is going to happen at any time, especially in this season of wild weather that we have in the summer season. Tuning into warnings, right? Staying on the pulse with that. So you can do that through apps and things now as well. And checking on your neighbors. Staying tuned in with the neighbors, right? Some more practical things. This is just more links to government websites. It's all common sense stuff, right? Staying on top of just general maintenance, staying on top of tidying up, reducing the vulnerability to those common threats, really common potential disasters and crises. Back to this alternative technology stuff, right? So we've got our food, water, heating, and power systems, right? These are kind of like the bones of what the basic systems we need, right, in our home and living environment. And one thing that I've kind of like found has been helpful for me to prepare for these things, because it can be very overwhelming, is using the power of 3. And so firstly, I aim to build up my capacity for one particular thing, just one thing, so I can get through 3 days. So how can I get through 3 days of power if I lose power? Thankfully, Taralay bought a generator. We have a generator sort of there. We have our cables just sort of setting up there permanently as well. So if we have to turn it on, it turns on relatively quickly. We can do 3 days quite comfortably because we've got fuel there. 3 weeks is a stretch. Running the generator for 3 months, probably not an option, but we've got 3 days covered. Food, right? Can I build up my capacity to have 3 days worth of food if something happens, whether it's in the ground or whether it's in my cupboards? Do I have 3 weeks worth of food? Can I get by with 3 weeks if I can't go to the shops for 3 weeks? Do I have enough? Will I be able to get by? I think I kind of am pretty close with that quite easily. I actually regularly go 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks sometimes without going to the shops. And 3 months, that would probably be a challenge. Like I do have 6 months worth of meat in the freezer. I do have 6 months worth of vegetables in the ground. So it probably could be done at a very tight stretch and limited diet. But it's a good thought experiment for us to all to run through, right? Do I have 3 days worth of food? Do I have 3 weeks worth of food, right? So we can kind of build up our capacity. Or water. Do I have 3 days worth of water? No. What do I have to do to get 3 days of water? What do I have to do to get 3 weeks worth of water, right? If the power goes out, do I lose water? Can I not flush the toilet because my house pump doesn't work? All these kinds of things. Good thought experiments to think about. But if we use the power of 3, we can bring it back. Hey, I'll just get 3 days. If I can get 3 days, then that's a little step. We can build ourselves up, build up our capacity. Okay, emergency kit. Again, this is just ripped straight from government websites. Good little link you can follow through. Get ready, queensland.gov.au, emergency kit that you might have at home. A lot of basic stuff there, which we would have if we're living off grid anyway, and we're only going to the shops once a month. This is kind of what we're building up this capacity, but also having a bug out kit, right? Like a camp kit. Like what's our kit if we're going bush for a week, right? Or do we go camping? Or are we not set up to go camping? Do we have somewhere to go if we do have to evacuate our property, right? So these things to think about. Obviously, having first aid kit is pretty important. And having some first aid skills or knowing someone with first aid skills. And another one that I've found has been pretty important is knowing mental health first aid, right? Like, because in these situations, people get tested to their limits, and it comes back to that emotional awareness stuff. Yeah, being able to read when people are in mental health crisis as well. So I'm ripping through this. This is good. It's just some random inspiring stuff here. Fire is a big threat for, I think, some of us here on the call, right? How do we mitigate fire threat? And it's amazing what happens when we plant water, right? This well-watered mulberry tree credited with saving a home on the New South Wales south coast from summer bushfires. Look at that picture. One mulberry tree, right? Just in the peak of dry season, it's well watered, it's lush, and it's green. And apparently the fire came through like in this direction. And because the tree was like, it buffered and deflected all of the heat, that had low grass around the house, the tree and the house survived. Pretty amazing. If you want to check it out, there's links to that article in there. This is another, interesting one. During my permaculture course, we visited a couple in Kinglake, Victoria, where we learned about the ways they prepared for the event of fire and stayed and defended their home. It was a day that I learned that we would need to prepare our home to fight fire, and we started to gather the knowledge that we needed to do it safely. The experience of staying and defending our home was traumatic and exhausting, and I would not wish it on anyone. The weeks afterwards were even harder, living in a home unrecognizable and barely functioning, though we would do it again. We love this place. We grew through the hardship. I want to help other people see that preparing to stay and defending safely is possible, right? So this is, it's a big thing. Like if we're going to stay and like bunker down through some impending doom or disaster, we've got to have the systems in place. We've got to have the mindset. We've got to have the physical systems in place, and also our trusted community network as well. In 2019, when we first got to the property, it was really dry, and there was fires that ripped all through Lamington National Park and Binnaburra, and it was looking pretty wild there at the time. I was at Changemakers Crystal Waters teaching the PDC, and some of the crew were on the property, and we had the police coming to our property telling everyone to evacuate. It was a little bit over the top because the fire was quite a way away, but everyone decided to stay, prepared to reassess the threat as it got closer, and stay and try and fight, I guess. So it's there's like a level of self-belief that's required to do that, rather than just blindly follow someone in a uniform and their authority. Back to the power of 3. when it comes to prepping, right? Or preparing for natural disaster, man-made disaster, personal, collective, global, local. Our mindset matters, right? Our approach, how we're looking after ourselves, having a resilient state of being, solutions focus, sense of humor, all of that, right? All of this matters. Then we need to have the practical systems. These are our off-grid systems, our food, our water, our power, our shelter, our heating, just the basic survival needs, the practical systems. And then we have our trust network, right? This trust network, which is what we're going to look at in this next slide, is probably, the most important. Like a prepper is sort of in these two systems, and they kind of want to go it alone. But actually what is required and what actually makes things work is having a trust network of people and relationships. This is the foundational layer of reality, I believe. I see it as. There's kind of three layers to this, right? The power of three again. There's our neighbors. Now, we might not get along with our neighbors. We might not be like-minded. We might not have the same worldview as our neighbors, but they are our neighbors. And when shit hits the fan, we kind of have to get along. And it helps if you have built some sort of relationship, some sort of trust with them so that, you guys can work together well, easily, better. So getting along with the neighbors is good. And, initiating conversations, having them over for cups of tea, whatever it is, right? To build that relationship. And we go through that process. We have our neighbors in the 1 acre block right in the middle who are highly impacted by anything that we do noise-wise, dust-wise, visually, that they can see crosses over into their thing. We just have to get along. We just have to manage that relationship with them, and we do that respectfully because they are our neighbors. They are basically part of our community, whether we like it or not. And then we can also build a community and a trust network with like-minded people. Like this course is that, right? We can get our fixes and have conversations of like, oh yeah, and share knowledge around particular things to help us get inspired and enlivened and continue this journey. So that's really important. Doing a course like this, plugging into Grounded's great, plugging into local community gardens or anything, right? Anything that's like sparking our curiosity that we want to tune into and build that trust network. And then we have the volunteer organizations, right? These are the more official channels where we can build up this network and, it's relationships with people, but it's also access to resources, right? These organizations have all these systems set up, response vehicles and all sorts of stuff. So we've got the SES at a local level. We've got the Rural Fire Service at a local level. There's probably some other ones. I don't know. If there is, drop them into the chat or let me know. But this is really important. This is why I started Grounded, right? Because I wanted a trust network of people that are into growing food, building community, and also celebrating and having, music and culture and arts. It's literally building this trust network so that I feel supported by a group of amazing people, if I was to put my own selfish reasons on it. But of course, there is the altruistic reasons because it's helping everyone else as well in the process. Okay, homework. How are we going for time? Oh yeah, pretty good. 7:49. Time flies when I'm doing these things, it feels like. I hope you guys have been enjoying it. I'd love to see a comment or something in the chat if I can get it up. Oh yeah, let me see the chat. Just like a little highlight or moment that's come to that you've appreciated in this session. A little nugget of value. What we're going to do for our homework, for our exercise this week, is from our sector analysis, we're going to ID our top 3 hazards, right? Now, maybe one of these hazards is not on the sector analysis, as you will see with my one that I did, just a rough version. Let's ID our top 3 hazards and the risk. So what was the worst that has happened maybe that, that you've witnessed happen. It doesn't have to be at this particular site, but the worst disaster or crisis that has happened to you, and that could happen, right? So maybe you've heard stories of, like when I talked about this flood, I was like, oh my God, that was crazy. 500 mils in 36 hours. No, could be worse. And it happened less than 10 years ago. Like, I was like, holy dooly. Okay, so what's the worst that has happened? What's the worst that could happen? Your experience, anecdotal evidence from locals or neighbors or something. And we can also reference objective data. So we should have maybe done some of this already through previous weeks of homework. And then what we want you to do is like a bit of a mind map, or jot down some notes. What was the most difficult aspect? What attitudes, skills, and qualities helped you recover? What would you do differently? What lessons emerged from that experience? And what are some simple steps that you can do to reduce the risk of said hazard? And remember, we focus on reducing our vulnerability through support systems, off-grid systems, and things to sort of buffer the vulnerability there. And we can also increase our capacity to cope, right? So this is our ability to respond, our resilience, our recovery mechanisms and systems in place, right? So if I go to, this is the last slide. I just did it real quick, and this is all you guys need to do for yourselves. It's a process, right? Once we start running these processes, we can just keep running them and running them. But this is what I did, right? So risk number one for me at our property is flash floods and storms, right? And what's the worst that has happened? Well, I've seen landslips, I've seen access cut, I've seen fallen trees, and that creek coming up. What's the lessons learned? Well, we have a lot of unstable soils. I should always assume the worst with rain, right? And I haven't even seen the worst of it. So don't send people across the creek in summer. Don't hold events in summer. I've stopped holding events in March and April because, they're just so wet. What's the worst that could happen? Well, we could have bigger slips. We could have more flash flooding. It's hard to imagine with water because I've seen so much of it where we are, to see what that might look worse. It's a little bit scary to imagine. And some simple steps to reduce risk. Okay. Keep all roads that we have on the property all weather accessible, right? That's a big one. We've put a bit of effort into keeping those roads accessible. And when we had the flood at New Year's Eve, half the party left between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. on New Year's Day with no one had to tow them out. Everyone got to drive out as soon as they wanted to, which was amazing. Like we've had previous years where it's just chaos and the roads are terrible and we have to tow every single car out. Oh my gosh. So we've learned that we've got good roads, people can get in and out. That's a good way to reduce the risk. And having off-grid power and water backup, right? So that was when that 12 days we had no power, and I was like, wow, this is a big vulnerability here. So then I made it a priority to get a solar system set up on the creek flat and to get a solar pump, so that we always have water pumping and we always have gravity water on the property. And even if the whole property is out of power, we can still go down to the creek flat and we can still access power. So that was another step that I took. And what else do we do? We plant trees with the rain, right? So when it's raining, we're working with these seasons to increase our food crop, and we keep our fuel stocked and keep our chainsaws ready to go, right? Like this is what I've learned from having so many flash floods and storms. Fire, right? So this only got close to us in 2019, but it is definitely a risk. What did I learn? Well, we are vulnerable to fire. We can say no to emergency services when they come around trying to tell us to leave. We don't have to do that. And what's the worst that could happen? Well, we could have like big fires like we had come through, and it hits the property. Now it's likely going to come from the north. Fortunately, we have water running, the river and the creek onto the north of us. We have a lot of mowed areas, right? So we keep a lot of green grass, which reduces a lot of fire risk. And then we also set up a mobile water pump, right? it's in pieces at the moment, but we have it set up. We have been using it. We have mostly to water the trees that we've been doing planting, but it works. We can fill up an IBC. We can run a pump. We can drive around somewhere and hose down whatever we need to hose, and also setting up the solar water pump so that we've always got water on gravity. So these are the things that we've done to sort of reduce that risk. And then the other one, the last one that I put there, which is kind of what I think about a lot, is some sort of collapse, some sort of economic collapse, currency collapse, supply chain collapse. You know, we've seen little tastes of that happen. We saw that with COVID and supply chain disruption. So that's all we've seen. I haven't seen it get worse, but it could be worse. Lessons learned. Okay, the mainstream system is fragile and it's conditional, right? It's enforced by coercion. So it's kind of made me a little bit more distrustful and motivated to set up more systems. What's the worst that could happen? Well, apparently there's going to be, a cyber virus that could attack financial systems. So what do I do to buffer myself against this? Well, I get on the base layer of reality, which is in connection with the land. I'm growing food. I'm building a trust network of people, right, that exists beyond, money and finance, where you can trade with strangers. But I want a trust network of people that I know that I can trade with without money. I want to develop my in-house capacity, right, to produce food, to manage our power, to manage our heating and water, all of that. So that's what I'm working on, is building our in-house capacity to take care of those things. And also like alternative economies, right? So this way of being able to trade with people, not only just in Australian dollars, but using Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies that exist outside of those networks, being able to just trade favors with people, being able to trade hours with people is also a good way to sort of build up that trust network and sort of buffer myself from any potential collapse within the system. That's what I see as a threat. And so these are the steps that I'm taking in a little process that I want all of you guys to do, because it's also part of our design, right? We're also building up this capacity with our permaculture designs. Okay, that's basically it. Before we stop, share, please drop a comment. What was a little gem that you got out of it? What was it good or not? I kind of went deep on it. That covered a lot of things, just threw together that which appealed and makes sense to me and that I've used. But I'd love to hear what you guys thought of it. Little nugget. What was a nugget? A thing that you're like, oh yeah, that's cool. I like that perspective. Anybody? Here we go. Regularly, I read articles about the disasters occurring, but I don't really think about it seriously and just continue on through life. This highlights for me the necessity to take it more seriously. Awesome, Mark. Yeah, because I think you'd also be vulnerable. Wait, it depends which mark it was. No, I don't know if you wouldn't have fires at your place, but Mark down in Wyong. Yeah, Mark, you've got flooding. Yep. David missed the beginning. Anyone else got anything to add? Can't see anything coming in. I think Travis is typing there. So that's basically the disaster thing. I hope you guys got some value out of it. The power of three is a good way of looking at it. Yeah, I think that's a good way. It's helped me a lot because I got so caught up in my own imagination about prepping, and I'm trying to plant bunya trees when I don't have anything else in place. The bunyas are not going to give me anything for 15 years. So it helped. Let's go, okay, 3 days of food, 3 days of water, 3 days of power, build that up to 3 weeks. David, yes, fire is a risk there. Yeah, requires definitely requires management to keep it back. It's always good to have a backup plan as well as an emergency plan. Yeah, there's lots of links there in the PDF. I'll upload that to the lesson tonight. David's got the Rural Fire Brigade to strengthen my community. Excellent, man. Great. It's on my list to do. I should do as well. in that slide there of the building up the trust network, I've really put so much energy into the like-minded, right? Building grounded, but plugging into volunteer orgs is another great way to do it. Explore the network state as an alternative economy. Yes, totally. We're going to get into all of that stuff in the next module. Really looking forward to it. It's kind of, I get to take the edge, take what the traditional permaculture thing is into new edges. Anyway, let's leave it there. Great to see you all. We'll be on the call Thursday night, 7 p.m. We can do any questions and answers. Yeah. Thanks, guys, for joining. See yous.